Alex, can you hear me?
Yes. Good morning.
Okay.
Hello all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll kick it over. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to this great conversation.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining our Idea Exchange event hosted by Florida International University and our platform in Washington, D.C. For this session, what we call Turning the Tide, the National Security Risks in the Face of Sea Level Rise. My name is Jayantha Obeysekera, otherwise known as Obey. I'm the director of the Sea Level Solution Center at FIU in the Institute of Environment. I have worked on climate change and sea level rise issues for 10-15 years. Local, regional, and national level. I was member of the National Climate Assessment in 2013 and has worked on a DoD SERDUP committee to develop regional sea level projections or installations around the world, which I will describe later on in this session. I want to thank our partners, the American Security Project, South Florida Defense Alliance, and South Florida Regional Planning Council. Before we get started, please mute your phones unless you're speaking. And also, if you would like to ask a question or comment, please enter that into the chat box and we'll be monitoring throughout this session. And also, please be sure to tag at FIUDC and also use the hashtag FIUSeaLevel. We welcome you to this national dialogue, and we hope that this to be a very informative and interactive session. Before we also get started, we would love to know everyone who is attending. Please, in the chat box, tell us who you are and what organization you represent. So let me first introduce our partners and our first speaker from the American Security Project, David Haines, Senior Fellow for Climate Security of the American Security Project. And I will let David take over from here.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I think it's going to be a great conversation, and I'm very glad to be joining. So I guess we'll go ahead and kick off. I'm Dave Haines. I'm the Senior Fellow for Climate Security for the American Security Project. Primarily, my job is to educate the public and Congress about the intersection of climate change and national security. We're a bipartisan think tank, and we've been doing events across the country for a long time, several in Florida in recent months, virtually, although we have an upcoming in-person event in Jacksonville. And over the years, our mission has been changing. Initially, it was to educate the public and public officials that may not prioritize climate change. More recently, there's been a widespread recognition of the importance of mitigation and resiliency, which is great. So now our mission is more to highlight the work that's being undertaken and to make sure that it's followed through. So why do we do this? Right? Our national security forces have to maintain their capability, and climate change causes several issues for military forces. Most obvious, there are issues with readiness and training. Bases in the West are threatened by wildfires, melting permafrost in Alaska damages infrastructure, building damage, reduced capacity, training disruption. All of this reduces our readiness and it costs money. Florida itself is threatened by increasingly frequent and damaging hurricanes, hotter temperatures, which restrict training, sunny day flooding due to sea level rise, which disrupts base access. And this is damaging to the families who work at bases, the units who train at them, and the high-level headquarters who are responsible for various parts of the globe. Florida hosts the commands for the Middle East, for Latin and South America, and Special Forces Command, which has responsibilities everywhere. There are also second-order effects. So climate change is what we call a threat multiplier. It requires additional contingency planning and response. It makes issues more severe and frequent. So, for example, the drought in Syria from 2007 to 2011 helped precipitate the civil war there. Melting sea ice in the Arctic opens up sea lanes, gives more access to natural resources, but it means that we have to patrol those areas with the same forces that we have now. And increased natural disasters means more humanitarian aid and disaster relief. And all of this requires more time, more money, and more concentration. And the last thing we look at is the most recent trend. The geopolitical status quo is changing. States are prioritizing climate action. Part of meeting our national security priorities is competing for influence, which usually means security agreements. So think Japan or Korea. Now we have those responsibilities and a new realm of competition. Renewable standards mean a worldwide changing infrastructure, which requires technology and international financing. They're new frontiers of partnering and influence. It's a tremendous opportunity for American interests and American business, but it's dangerous too. Without quick action, we'll lose these opportunities to China, who dominates renewable markets. So kind of bringing things back down to Florida. Florida is a key region. It's a meeting of climate susceptibility and national security infrastructure. As you know, there are bases all across the state. Of the Air Force facilities, 6 of the 10 most threatened nationwide are in Florida, including Homestead. NAS Key West is threatened, Mayport, Pensacola. And so building resiliency in all these areas requires data for assessment, data that's provided by places like FIU, and assessments that are conducted, at the local and state level. Recent legislation helped with that in Florida. And there's DoD assessments, NOAA assessments. But translating all of these into action is imperative, right? ASP focuses on solutions at all levels, so local and state solutions, but really where we focus the most of our attention is at the federal level. Federal solutions that keep local priorities in mind. There are programs from FEMA, for instance, flood mitigation assistance, building resilient infrastructure in communities before disasters, hazard mitigation grant program afterwards. There are also some DoD-specific programs. So the Military Installation Sustainability Program, that provides funds for studies, which local and state governments can implement. And the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which grants $50 million for projects, but that is nationwide and per year. Now, when you've got infrastructure plans in a place like Jacksonville or Tampa Bay that are numbering about $2 billion to really fix the problems, you can see that $50 million across the country is a drop in the bucket. Now, there are a host of other efforts too that can be pursued, from salt marsh preservation on the Eastern Shore, to Sentinel landscape programs, which preserves landscapes around bases, to programs undertaken by the Corps of Engineers. But right now, what communities need is the final assurance that plans and assessments are going to be translated into action. And we believe educating citizens will make this a priority for their elected officials. So thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, David. Again, don't forget to type your name on the chat and also what organization you represent. And also type the comments or questions on the chat box. Hopefully we'll have some time to respond to those towards the end. Next, let me introduce Richard Miller. He's the Executive Director of South Florida Defense Alliance. And I will ask Richard to take it away from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Obi. Appreciate that. Thanks, David, for that great kickoff. I'm the Executive Director of the South Florida Defense Alliance, focused here in the southeast corner of the state. I'm also on the Board of Directors and serve as the Mission Sustainment Chair for the Florida Defense Alliance, which is a statewide organization looking at these issues across the entire state. I'm also joined, I just saw in the chat, by one of my colleagues in SFDA, Pamela Rukowski, I see is online as well. Hello, Pamela. Let me just start with a real quick primer for folks, just to have an idea of the scope of defense across the state, because I think a lot of people don't realize it. And then we'll talk a little more specifically about resilience and where we're going with that. So as you can see on the slide here, for the last several years, defense has been sort of rattling around the top 3 economic drivers in the state. Everybody knows Florida, tourism driven and agriculture driven. The latest data, which is shown here, which is actually a couple years old already, defense had really kind of moved up into the 2nd spot ahead of agriculture at nearly $100 billion and 1 million jobs annually and growing, was showing strong growth in the state. And venture a guess in 2020, once all the data is finally in with the pandemic shutdown, defense may have been the resilient portion of the economy in the state of Florida, given the hit that tourism and agriculture took last year. So we are definitely and have always been military friendly, but more importantly, moving the state towards being even more military ready. And that means to host and support and sustain missions of all kinds all across the state. Next slide, Alex. So as you can see here, and David alluded to it earlier, there's quite a laydown of military missions, bases, and commands in Florida. And not even all of them are shown on this slide. This is just showing you some of the major highlights, but it's, over nearly 36 fairly significant locations. You can see the small blue dots are actually defense industry, private sector, spread all across the state. And then you can see this large presence of bases and installations. I think David alluded to the fact that we've got 3 of the Unified Combatant Commands headquartered here in Florida. We've got the military's only East Coast Space Launch Facility and the Space Range on the Eastern Range at the Cape, and the new Space Force bases there at Patrick and Cape Canaveral. We've got a number of research and development activities. We've got the Navy's support activity in Orlando, which is really, in some ways, the Orlando area has become kind of the capital of modeling and simulation across the Defense Department. And all of that supports a very robust training, test, and evaluation range complex that's scattered across the state. It's ringed by Navy operating areas all around the state. We've got the Eglin Test Range up at Eglin Air Force Base, Avon Park, the Pine Castle Bombing Range, which is the Navy's only live impact bombing range on the East Coast. And then we've got this wonderful asset called the Joint Gulf Range. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is just an example of one of the ranges that encompasses really all of our operating areas, connected from down around Naval Air Station Key West all the way up to the naval support activity in Panama City and Eglin's test range on shore. And all this area offshore, surrounded by the blue line there, are the operating areas that encompass this. And what this is showing you very uniquely is that in comparison to the land and airspace out in the Western United States over several of the other premier training ranges shown there, the White Sands Missile Range, the Utah Test Training Range, the Edwards Air Force Base, China Lake and Nellis ranges, that to scale, even if you put all of those into the Gulf Range area, the Gulf Range still has miles and miles of training and test capabilities that far exceed any capacity anywhere else in the United States. And as we look at 5th and 6th generation aircraft and their capabilities, we talk about developing hypersonic capabilities for the Defense Department. The ability to have range, test and training ranges that can truly encompass those assets and use them to their fullest of their capabilities is incumbent on having the unencumbered range space. And really, the Joint Gulf Range is probably the only place in the United States where that's possible. And as we jokingly say, the nice part about the range complex in Florida, you can literally go from the seafloor to outer space and back, and everything in between, both live, synthetic, cyber, and virtually, all in one state. And I'm not sure you can make that claim anywhere else in the country. Okay, so quick touch on the Florida complex. Next slide. When we shift into the resilience game, there's been some good developments, particularly in the last year. The state recently passed state legislation, and the governor signed just a few weeks ago a nearly $650 million coastal resilience program to enhance efforts across the state. And there was connections in there to make sure that military installations and facilities are accommodated within that effort. As you can see on the right side there's 10 regional planning councils across the state, and they do a fantastic job supporting the military and on a lot of traditional encroachment and other planning and zoning type issues. What's really been happening now, the slide or the picture on the left, excuse me, is you see these regional climate collaboratives that have been developing around Florida. Now, the green one down there in the Southeast Florida Climate Change Compact has, I'd say, been the founding one, been around for now nearly 12 years. has been the first in the state, really one of the first in the country and in the world, and has really been the model upon which the others are building. And as you can see, there's a nice, reasonable alignment between these climate compacts and the Regional Planning Council, boundaries and geographies, and that really works to benefit. And so what this enables now as we move forward into a world that's focused on unified sea level rise projections, resilience standards, and how we advance these things in different areas of the state. We are growing a nice synergy between these climate compacts, the regional planning councils, and then we also, in the Florida Defense Alliance, we have regional defense alliances that really fit these locations very nicely. For example, our South Florida Defense Alliance, covers the Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, Monroe County region, which is coincident with the climate compact down here. We have a counterpart, Tampa Bay Defense Alliance, which matches up nicely with the area represented by the Tampa Bay Council and the Tampa Bay Collaborative Compact. And so we're starting to connect these defense interests with the regional planning councils and these climate compacts to help work on these resilience challenges. And my last slide, please. One quick example of that. Oop, my last slide dropped off. Not sure what happened to it, but so we are doing this now in South Florida. We are leveraging state funds from the Florida Defense Support Task Force, and we're using that to apply for federal funds from the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation in DOD. And I actually saw Bill Van Houten was online from Old CC. Welcome, Bill. Thanks for signing on today. And we're working with them. We have put together a team of the Defense Alliance with the South Florida Regional Planning Council and Dr. Obey and the team at FIU to coordinate one of these study efforts. And we'll be integrating officials and work and folks from across the 3 counties involved, Broward, Miami-Dade, and Monroe, multiple city municipalities, as well as multiple other nonprofit and different economic development and regional planning groups to really do a regional study on the defense clusters in Southeast Florida, which are concentrated around, as we said earlier, Naval Air Station Key West, Homestead Air Reserve Base, the Southern Command Headquarters, and a Navy test range up in Broward County, and all the different tenant commands that involve those. So with that as a quick summary, I'll stop there and hand it back over to Obi and look forward to the question and answer at the end.
Thank you, Richard. Can you all see my screen? Can you see the full screen now, Alex? Hello?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. So again, my name is Jayantha Obeysekera. I'm the director of the Sea Level Solutions Center in the Institute. My experience had been in climate change and sea level rise in the last 10, 15 years. I've worked on locally, I think what Richard mentioned, the Southeast Climate Compact. I chaired the committee for developing unified sea level rise projections. And all the way at the national level or federal level, I was part of a DOD committee that looked at the vulnerability and sea level rise projections for installation throughout the world that I will describe today. I want to acknowledge my colleague and Professor Michael Sukop, and we work together on sea level rise issues. But today I will talk about primarily a little bit of science and some experience I have with the assessment of DOD installations due to sea level rise and the projections, and some of the work I'm already doing. So in terms of science, which is kind of my role in bringing into the work that we might jointly do with our partners here. Now, when you look at global sea level rise, the rate is about 3.3 millimeters per year. Sorry, it's in metric units, it's about 9-10 inches. It's in the last century, for example. But I just saw news today that it has further increased to 3.4. So there is general recognition that the sea level rise it's accelerating, and you only have to see some evidence of flooding in places like Miami Beach know that it is rising and it's already affecting communities. So when you look at the sea level rise regionally, it's not rising at the same level or same rate, and you will see why why it's happening. I will explain that in next few slides. But so if you have all these military installations worldwide, DoD installations, they are all going to be affected at different rates. So it's important to understand the projections at a particular location, and that's the type of work I had done with the committee that was established by DoD SERDA program. We looked at over 1,700 installations worldwide. As you can see from this graphic on the lower left, about 1,200 installations in the US, but more than 200 international. So we had to go around the world to make sea level rise projections through time to understand their vulnerabilities. And one thing I think David mentioned is a threat multiplier, but that threat is increasing. As you can see on the lower right-hand corner of the picture, considerations are increasing. Initially, you might do some maintenance actions, but later on, you'll have to have some major refurbishment and eventually base realignment. So it's important to understand when these threat multipliers may come into play, and that's where the sea level rise projections come in. So if you look at all the tide gauges around the country, around continental US, you see up arrows indicating that in all places, or in most places, it's rising around the global average, but in some places higher than and the global, because the land is also subsiding in places like Louisiana. For example, if you're in the Gulf, that rate is almost 2 or 3 times higher than the global rate because the land is also subsiding. But if you're in Alaska, where there is tectonic uplift, you might actually see a sea level falling. But in most places, it's increasing. As you can see in Florida, it's a little more than the global average. I won't go through this, all these pictures, but this is kind of what's happening in Florida right now. Airport was flooded. There's a place in the Keys, just from the tide, the neighborhood was flooded for more than 60 days. And this is the sign of things to come in many places. You see this video in Miami Beach, this is what we call sunny day flooding. And I was driving this vehicle and all this salty water on the road, people have to wear boots to go to a grocery store. But I want to highlight this one in the bottom here, this groundwater effect of sea level rise. Basically, we have porous limestone, like you see that rock, rotating rock, it's like Swiss cheese. So you can't build a dam or levee and stop that sea level. The water is going to come underground towards the well fields. But more importantly, in the light of what happened in Surfside building collapse, it's not only important, it's important to look at above ground, the buildings like during hurricane, but now it's also important to look at below ground. The salt water is intruding, and this is the type of work we do. I work with Mike, and I will mention one example of the work we had done. So let me kind of explain why sea level is rising. There are 3 primary reasons at the global level why the average is rising. One is obviously the thermal expansion. Over 90% of the heat, extra heat, is absorbed by the ocean. That causes thermal expansion in the ocean volume. There's also land water storage. In other words, you either build dams or let water out, that adds to the ocean budget. But more importantly, one important aspect of sea level rise is this ice melt from land-based glaciers, and more importantly, actually, the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. And this is where the modeling and the scientific community is trying to understand how fast and at what rate they would melt, because they could add significant amount of sea level rise into the global level. And you see this video on the right, basically what happens, particularly in Antarctica, these ice sheets, you have this warm water coming underneath the ice sheets, could lead to what is known as ice sheet collapse or ice cliff collapse. And that would add significant amount of sea level rise. And in the remainder of this slide, you see this, there are three other reasons why the regional sea level rise rate is not the same. Those are the vertical land movement, as I mentioned, in places like Louisiana. The ocean dynamics, you see, the ocean currents will affect the sea level rise. For example, off the coast of Florida, we have the Gulf Stream. And if it is slowing down due to climate change, it's going to raise the sea level. The land itself is moving up or down depending on the ice sheet. You know, this is like what is known as GIA, or the land itself is expanding as the ice load on the surface is being removed through melting. And one last important aspect that we don't talk much about is called the gravitational effect. This melting ice in big ice sheets will actually change the gravitational field around the world. So if you are next to Antarctica, the sea level will actually fall, but elsewhere in the world, the sea level actually will rise due to that change in gravitation. The important thing is when you look at the vulnerability of DoD sites, we really have to look at all these the effects of regional sea level rise. Fortunately, I had the privilege of working on a committee known as Coastal Assessment Regional Scenario Working Group, organized by DoD CERDUP program, and we published this report. I worked extensively on this report. I was one of the authors, and we looked at over 1,700 installations worldwide, and they were all types of installations. And we looked at the sea level rise projections for all of them. In this project, we came up with several scenarios for sea level rise. And why do we have these scenarios? We don't know enough about how those ice sheets would melt. You know, if all the ice in Greenland melts, there would be 20 feet of sea level rise added to the ocean. And you don't want to even know how much it would add from Antarctica. So we really had to look at various scenarios. That's basically a risk-based assessment, you know, what could happen under extreme sea level rise scenario. Our work was basically published in what is known as a regional sea level database, and anybody can look at this. And you know, the work was pretty much for all the installations around the continental US. It had this nice website. It breaks down the vertical land movement, ocean circulation, and melt effects, and even the extreme sea level. So this is a nice tool that we can use for planning, you know, sea level rise for the installations, and both David and Richard talked about. So what is the challenge in assessing one of these sites? Basically, we have to look at the resilience of the installation through time, which is going to change. And that's, you need to consider the sensitivity of the site itself for sea level rise, the exposure, are we going to have more storms and rising sea levels? And what is the vulnerability of the installation? Not only the buildings, but all the other aspects above and below ground, the utility systems and others. And what is the adaptive capacity? That is what we need to do for any given installation, and which is kind of what we did in an example project I'm going to mention. We're still working on this. This is the Naval Amphibious base in Coronado and Silver Strand Training Complex. It's an interesting place where it's bordered by both on the bay side in San Diego and ocean side. And we are looking at the sea level rise, storm surge, flooding on this side, and understanding also the groundwater implications. You know, will the sea level rise intrude salt water into the bays? And how will it affect the utilities that may be underground or foundations, like what we are talking about in the seaside event we are just going through right now. And what are we doing here? We are also looking at various aspects of, let's say, waterfront structures, like the small craft piers. So the idea is that the sea is rising, as you see on the right-hand side, you know, what are the threat levels? Basically, due to minor, moderate, and major sea levels that would affect the functionality of this particular installation or installation of piers. Similarly, we're looking at all the other aspects of the base, to see what is the vulnerability of the site, and also what are the adaptation options that are available. And this can be repeated for all the installations or critical installations around the world. And similar to what David and Richard said, this is the type of analysis we would want to do in places like South Florida. With that, with this picture from Houston flooding, I will stop and we can see what kind of questions we have and try to respond to those. Alex, do you have any comments or questions? Or we can open, if you like, you can speak, right? Or we can repeat your questions on the chat box.
Yeah, of course, Holly, we have a question from you if you'd like to ask it, or happy to read as well.
Yes, thank you so much for your engaging presentations. I was wondering, what takeaways you would want local, state, and even national policymakers to be aware of and to consider for sea level rise, both on the mitigation and the resilience front.
I could start, maybe David and Richard could. From a scientific point of view, I think, as I mentioned, individual installations may have different vulnerabilities and exposure. I think we need to understand their exposure and vulnerabilities, and then see how vulnerable are the facilities in those sites. And then eventually, timing of when certain things might happen. And because you really need a lead time to be adaptive to, to respond to those types of vulnerabilities. So I think that type of studies are needed, and I'm hoping the funding would be available for these installations to basically do the scientific work necessary before you actually develop and implement adaptation strategies. I don't know if David and Richard have any comments they want to make.
Well, I would add to what Obi said. I agree with everything he said, but I would add to that particularly for local and state partners, don't assume that the military and the federal bases and the federal partners have everything in hand. So many of our bases are reliant on the communities that surround them for support. They get their water, their sewer, their electric, their communication, runs through the road accesses. And so, all of our installations are dependent on their community partners. And one of the things I think we've realized is, here in Florida, particularly on sea level rise here in Southeast Florida, we're, I'd say, light years ahead of the rest of the country on this topic in the civilian community. It doesn't mean we always had the defense aspects of that fully built into the plans and the strategies and the ways ahead. And so I would encourage, the bases and federal partners to reach out to state and local, and I would encourage state and local to ensure they remember the federal and military partners when they're looking at these issues and building the comprehensive plans, because I think there's a way that we can essentially stack resources and find mutual and collaborative solutions in a better way than everybody trying to do it on their own.
David, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think Rick really nailed it there. Knowing what's available to you as a state and local official is very important. And there are a lot of different options that may not be talked about regularly, say at a county level. But if you look at a place like Northeastern Florida, and I'm knee deep in that right now, there are options, ranging from national park funding to the Corps of Engineers and what they do with dredging material, right? Whether that goes offshore or it goes into soft shoreline solutions. There are options available. Where the funding comes from, it might be state, it might be local. There are opportunities for federal funding, but it takes some legwork. And I think things like climate resiliency officers that can identify that and that can link up, either state agencies, federal agencies, or agencies within an area are very important. And putting the emphasis there to know what your resources are is a big part of the maintenance problem.
Do you have any follow-up questions?
No, we have, if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute your mics and pose a question to our panelists.
Quiet crowd today.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry. This is Bill Van Houten from Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. So it's kind of a newbie to what's going on in Florida. I'm intrigued by what's been going on with these climate compacts that have been around for 12 years and exactly what they've managed to accomplish and what their role is going forward.
Yeah, let me kind of maybe I've been involved in that group for some time. One thing, 5-10 years ago, maybe more than 5 years ago, the communities in Southeast Florida, like Palm Beach and Broward and Miami-Dade, they had their own sea level rise projections, and sometimes they're off by 1 foot or 2 feet, right? So, and that was not conducive to good planning. So what Compact did was to assemble a group of experts, and I was part of that all along. And last one, I chaired the committee. We came up with what is known as unified sea level rise projections. And I think that was a major accomplishment. Now, all the local and hopefully regional governments are using the same projections for planning. Second accomplishment, they have what they call regional climate action plan. There are over 100 action items that are basically providing input to local and regional governments for ranging from greenhouse gas mitigation and basically resiliency efforts. And the compact also supported what is done by the Miami-Dade County, what is known as the R305 plan, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. So there's ongoing work. I think that kind of collaboration through their summit has been very effective. And at the national level, it's recognized as the model that should be duplicated elsewhere in the country. And even in other countries are interested in that. And recently, we also published what is known as a climate indicator set, basically educating the public, what do the data show in terms of nuisance flooding, in terms of saltwater intrusion, in terms of rainfall pattern changes, those types of things. So they have produced a lot of good things for the local governments to assist in their resiliency planning.
Hey, Bill, thanks for the question. And just to build on what Obi said, and I may have given a false impression. So not all of the climate compacts in Florida have been around for 12 years. The first one, the Southeast one, started about 12 years ago. The ones you saw on the map, the others have been, I'll say, within the last probably 2 to 3 years that have been started essentially following that model and pursuing similar types of initiatives to what Obi just outlined. And I noted Ada Clark in the chat right before we started said the Emerald Coast Regional Council Board recently approved the formation of a resilience collaborative in April. So it looks like we may be seeing yet another regional climate collaborative out in the northwest corner of Florida, which will align nicely with a significant laydown of military presence in the Panhandle.
So I'll just say, Rick, Emerald Coast has actually contacted our office as well about doing a grant up there. So yeah, I think we'll be working with them. You didn't give me a false impression. I mean, I think you made it clear that it was 12 years just in the southeastern part of the state. I'm just trying to. So I guess I'm also interested. So the state has its climate projections, and I think FIU has also works with the DoD, NOAA, et cetera, on this. So I'm just wondering, so how do the states the state sea level rise projections mesh in with what is going on at the federal level?
Well, the state, I mean, I'll start, maybe others may have comments on that too. It's good to see that state is ramping up on the response to sea level rise. And they have a couple of Senate bills, that are actually in law. Now the local governments have to be resilient against the sea level rise. I think, particularly Senate Bill 1954, if I remember correctly, I think that type of approach at the state level, which is kind of unprecedented, is very encouraging to see. Now, there are a lot of NOAA people involved in the local efforts, and even at the state level, DEP is involved in this. They have regular webinars on resiliency planning and coastal issues, and I think many of the NOAA people are involved in that. So there is collaboration at the state level, particularly at the staff level with NOAA scientists. So I'm very encouraged to see that. And now with this new Senate bill, they're going to have, I think there's a flood hub that they have talked about, and hopefully there will be immense collaboration across the state on that. And finally, this is I don't think the state will come and say, you have to use this sea level rise projection throughout the state, because it varies from one location to another. And, I think they will be open to look at what, Southeast has done and other climate compacts have done, and they will incorporate all that into the statewide guidance or recommendation. And finally, I have a Florida Department of Transportation project to understand what would climate change and sea level rise mean for transportation system in the state. And we are just beginning to look at that. It's not just sea level rise. I think we have to also look at rainfall changes, and as I mentioned, groundwater table rising due to sea level rise, and what are the implications? How do you plan for this multiple threat situation we have? Anyway, with that, I will leave it at that.
Well, and Obi, I will compliment you. Your memory was very good. So it was Senate Bill 1954 was the one I referenced earlier about the $650 million new program that was signed into law last month. Bill, to your point, and I think we might have a rep or two from the state DEP department online, so feel free for them to jump on. But I am not aware that the state has a unified sea level rise projection that applies, from Pensacola to Key West and everywhere in between. In fact, I think to Obi's point, for the things that the state has been looking at, particularly here in Southeast Florida, they've very much been looking at the unified sea level rise projections that have been developed by the compact and have been widely adopted and recognized as the, I'll say, gold standard for, how to do that work on a regional basis. So I think we will see tight integration from both the regional here at the state level, and also to the work that we're attempting to do, Bill, with your office and the team down here, show an example of how to pull that together along with the DoD standards and policies in those areas to ensure that, a particular area has the best, or I'll say the most optimal projections available to them to do that planning work, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Any other question? I see a question here. I wonder if my colleagues on the panel could respond to that. How is DoD working with private sector in addressing and developing adaptation and mitigation solutions? I was wondering if either one of you have any response to that.
I can jump in with that. I think, across the DoD, when we talk about military construction and projects that occur, on the base, some of those are going to be done via private sector companies that come on and have contracts for them. So I think there's, anytime you've got anything being addressed at, on a DoD installation, you're going to see some private sector operations on there. But even more so when we talk about this, going outside the fence line, you really need that collaboration, with the state and the local government, but that's really going to involve private industry as well, because a lot of the things that get addressed, they affect private interests, and so there is that close collaboration. There's stakeholder input from all sides, and then when we talk about implementing solutions, those are going to be through the private sector in a lot of cases.
Well, there is also another question on the chat. Do you have any ideas on effective strategies to convince climate change skeptics to support resilience and climate policies? And this has been an issue for some time. I don't know, Mike, if you want to chime in or somebody else, but in my mind, it's a lack of education and outreach and understanding. I think, we have to convince, particularly in the state of Florida, this is not something for the future. It's already affecting communities, particularly near the coastline. For example, when you have, 2 or 3 times a year, there's flooding on the street, people cannot go to the grocery store, or your car is half underwater, and that is going to get worse in the future. There's a paper recently that was published that it is going to take off, by about 2030. That rate of flooding will increase for reasons that I won't try to explain right now. But this is the type of evidence that we had to provide for the general public, that it is already happening. This is what to be expected. We have data to show that, when you have your community like in the Keys, you're flooded just by tide for 60 days continuous. There shouldn't be any doubt about the what is happening with the rising sea levels, I think. And this is something that didn't happen before. I think that the role of non-governmental organization, particularly for educating the public, I think it's very important. And more importantly, I think we also need to educate basically through the education system, we have to inform the younger generations of what is to be expected in the future.
Well, and from the civilian, Obi did a nice summary from the civilian community. I think on the military side, the way I've started to say it to certain defense officials and stuff to think about it is put it in terms they understand. They've always understood the term encroachment, usually from incompatible development or building interest or things that would, challenge the use of a runway or training ranges or things. And the way I've said it to coastal facilities is, look, you just need to think of sea level rise as nature's form of encroachment. It's going to come and encroach on the base, and, unlike a planning or zoning board that you can appeal to try to block or stop, a development project that becomes an incompatible development, this one doesn't have an appeal board to go argue. You've got to look at it from the terms of resilience. You have to look at it from the terms of, mitigations and adaptations. But it is a never ceasing form of encroachment, and particularly for those low-lying at least sea level rise, those low-lying installations, they need to do it. I will say Bill Van Houten's comment earlier was actually encouraging to me, because that tells me that our message is working. If in fact the Emerald Council, the Emerald Coast Regional Council, is standing up a climate compact, and they're reaching out to Old CC to pursue, funding to do defense related work, that tells me that the message is getting out and it's working across the state. And so I'm encouraged by that in my statewide Florida Defense Alliance hat, and we need to continue that message around the state to protect, this wonderful defense complex that we have here in Florida.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, we can quickly wrap this up. And let's wait another minute or two. Okay, so there's another comment. Can you please comment on the impact of climate change and sea level rise on Southcom's mission or opposite tempo? I don't know, maybe Richard or David can respond to that.
I mean, I think I can respond in the general sense that anytime you have climate change and destabilizing effects, if we're looking at Southcom, we're looking at, go back to the more frequent hurricanes and more intense hurricanes. That's going to be humanitarian aid and disaster relief missions that'll take capacity away from, say, a Air Force carrier group or a Marine unit that's supposed to be deploying somewhere else and is now deploying within the Southcom area of operations to assist in disaster relief. These are things that are going to affect kind of every command around the globe, and the bigger that command and the more susceptible that command is to disasters like hurricanes, the more they're going to have to spend their time dealing with it. And that's going to take away from readiness that we think of in terms of more traditional national security, like training, training fighter units or training, land-based tactical units. All of that it's a zero-sum game. And the more time you spend on climate change, the less you spend on everything else.
Yeah, if I can follow up, I think it's another example is what I mentioned earlier, the Naval Amphibious base in Coronado. That's a very important training facility. And if the climate change and the sea level rise is going to interfere with their training program, which is a very important, program for the Navy there. And I think that's what they understood it to be a concern. And that's why they, basically funded this study for that particular set of bases in the Pacific. Similar to that, every other location, there might be operational constraints because of the future changes in climate or sea level rise. And fortunately, the publishing that database that I showed you earlier, every installation manager or the commander can look at it and see what are my vulnerabilities and start planning for it. I think that's the good news that this has been recognized as an important threat for future operations.
Well, and just to amplify David's point, beyond just the immediate demand for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief forces in Southcom, particularly in the Caribbean islands and places like that with the higher frequency and greater severity of storms, think about the instability in the Central American corridor. And with storms going in there, we had several Category 5 very strong hurricanes at the end of last season go into Honduras and that region. And that's an area that's already fueling a lot of the migration and the challenges we see on the southwest border. And now you magnify that with essentially climate change displacement on top of economic and security displacement. It just magnifies the problem.
So there are a couple of more questions on the chat box. Let's try to cover that before we wrap up. From Thomas is looking at the economic impact to local communities of base closures or reduced capacity may get the attention of members of Congress. Are such studies happening? Maybe that's the kind of study we are trying to propose for South Florida region, Richard. I don't know if Richard or David are aware of some studies like that.
I think, part of this is that there are very few other options for these things. We talk about having a deep water port facility with an airfield adjacent. It's not something that you can necessarily pick up and move from one place to another, nor would you want to. The cost of doing that is far beyond the cost of resilient measures and has impacts to the community that are significant. And we're also talking about a nationwide phenomenon. If you're talking damage to Air Force facilities in Florida, we should consider damage to Air Force facilities in Nebraska, where there was significant flooding. This is not a problem that you can evade by hopscotching around. And I think the problems are significant enough that they have gotten congressional attention, which is very good, and that attention will continue through events like this and efforts being made like they are in Florida.
Well, there's one last question here, unless Richard had something to say, but let me go ahead and pose that question. What proactive actions have been taken by communities and bases that you would want others to replicate? I'll quickly mention, we always hear Norfolk. That's one of the areas that they are already doing a lot of work in terms of increasing the resiliency. That's something that I know is a good example of the kind of studies I think that are needed in other places. And I let Richard or David, mention others if they're familiar with other studies.
Well, it's certainly the study efforts, but I would also go back to my previous comment that it's building the relationships between the mission sustainment focused people at the installations and the commands with their counterparts in the civilian community to ensure that when there's planning going on or there's shortfalls or needs or gap analysis or solutions being proposed, that we're looking at comprehensive solutions and not thinking that the base is taking care of itself by itself and that the feds have that one, or that it becomes an afterthought after a broader community strategy is already developed. So I think from a proactive standpoint, building that, getting studies done, but getting that dialogue going and building those robust relationships on a continuing basis and not just a one-off study effort is very important.
Thank you, Richard. Let's wrap this session up now. We have about 2 minutes. I want to thank all the partners in this panel, American Security Project and South Florida Defense Alliance and South Florida Planning Council, and particularly want to thank Alex for organizing the meeting and his tremendous support to have this. And I also want to thank everybody for attending, and obviously you can send us emails if you have further questions and comments, and I'll let other panelists if they have any concluding remarks.
No, I was just going to say thanks very much for this opportunity and a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. I'm available for questions, anything else, and we're looking forward to working with you all in the future.
All right.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody taking the time. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Great work. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Let us know if you have any questions, or feel free to shoot us a note if you have any additional information you'd like to share. But really appreciate everyone joining. So thank you so much for this collaboration.
Okay. Thank you, Alex.